I'm Vinnie Politan, the subject of my investigation, the never-ending controversy surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. It's the story that no one seems to want to tell. How powerful were the people he was connected to? And have they suppressed the truth? When will the public learn the whole truth? Here's the story.
Jeffrey Epstein was a financier and convicted sex offender who owned Little St. James, a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which he purchased in 1998. The island, often referred to as Pedophile Island, was allegedly a site where Epstein orchestrated illicit activities involving minors. In 2008, Epstein faced charges for soliciting a minor for prostitution. He secured a controversial plea deal with federal prosecutors, pleading guilty to lesser state charges. This agreement granted him a 13-month sentence with work release privileges and immunity from federal prosecution for himself and potential co-conspirators. Why would prosecutors ever give immunity to potential co-conspirators? Who was Epstein protecting? That was and continues to be the big question surrounding the Epstein case. In 2019, he was arrested again on federal charges of sex trafficking minors, and all that reignited discussions about this previous plea deal and the extent of his influential connections. Then, before any deal or trial could happen, Epstein was found dead in his jail cell. But his death has not stopped the public pursuit for information about any other powerful people connected to Epstein.
This is one of those cases, one of those stories, one of those investigations where we always feel like there is more to this, that we're not getting the whole story, that we're not getting the whole truth. And obviously there have been criminal prosecutions, there's discovery, there's documents, there's all types of material, but how much of that has been made public? Well, we've got a new administration at the Department of Justice, and recently some things were released, including the Epstein contact list, which redacts all of the contact information, but has a list of names, people like Mike Bloomberg, John Cleese from Monty Python, Mick Jagger, George Hamilton, the man with the perpetual tan, Andrew Cuomo, Courtney Love, Ivanka and Ivana Trump, and Donald, Barbara Walters. Like, it's a mishmash of people, and obviously he's, you know, rubbing elbows with the rich and the famous. But these are all part of the contact list that's been released. There was also a masseuse list that was released, but it was heavily redacted. And again, the redactions are, what we've been told, is to protect the identities and information connected to victims. So, where are we in all this? There is more information that the Department of Justice and the FBI has. And that brings us to the first question in our investigation. What hasn't been released? This is the question that's been ongoing for the longest time. Like, we had a trial, we had documents sealed, then unsealed, and then not released and redacted. Joining us to help try to get to the bottom of all this, reporter Kate Hussey with Scripps News Group in West Palm Beach, Florida, and former federal prosecutor and president of the West Coast Trial Lawyers, Nima Rahmani. Okay, Kate, do we have an idea of what has not been released?
Yeah, Vinny, good evening. According to U.S. Attorney Pam Bondi, thousands of documents from the FBI's New York office haven't been released. She says that she's received a truckload of those after she released about 200 pages. You, of course, mentioned the masseuse list, the contact book pages, and flight logs as well. She's saying there's thousands of other documents that exist out there that we have never laid eyes on. And we've spoken to our sources down here in Palm Beach County that worked really closely with this case when it was first being prosecuted. The former state attorney over this Palm Beach County district. We've spoken to an FBI agent, former FBI agent very close to this case, who do say that when the FBI raided Epstein's home in 2019, they also found a thumb drive in a safe. And prosecutors in our area have said that that information, whatever is on that thumb drive, also hasn't been released. Part of that, as you mentioned, could be to protect the identity or identities of victims that, their identities could be revealed on that thumb drive. But the criticism here is, I think, from Pam Bondi, we heard that she did receive those thousands of documents, but has never said when we might get to lay eyes on those.
Nima Rahmani, why are we here in 2025 and this is still an issue? A case like this that was, surrounded in controversy from the beginning, going back all the way to 2008. Everyone was smelling that something wasn't right. Why has it taken so long for the government to provide, the federal government, which you used to work for, to provide some transparency here?
Well, it started with what you said, Vinny. Alex Acosta, when he was U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of Florida, gave Jeff Epstein an unprecedented sweetheart deal, unconscionable. And, obviously, my former law professor, Alan Dershowitz, was instrumental in securing that deal, but he shouldn't have received that. And then, obviously, because of some very good reporting by folks in Florida, they exposed Jeffrey Epstein for the predator that he is, and the civil lawsuits followed. And so some of the issues were the judges in the case took a very broad view of redacting and sealing, which that I do not like. Everything that's filed, unless, of course, it needs to protect a victim or there's some other legitimate privacy reason, should be public. And then you have Ghislaine Maxwell after Jeff Epstein kills himself. She pushes her case to trial, and she really doesn't say anything. And she really is the person who is the key to all the information now. And I'm surprised she still hasn't cooperated now that she's lost her appeals and she's going to spend essentially the rest of her life in federal prison. But part of the problem, Vinny, is people that are watching think that there's a client list. We've talked about the flight logs. We've talked about the contact list. This was already made public in different lawsuits. There's nothing new in Attorney General Bondi's Phase 1 binders. It was one of the most overhyped but underwhelming reveals I've ever seen. And people on both sides were upset. A lot of conservatives that think that different administrations, Democratic administrations, have covered up for Jeffrey Epstein to protect themselves. But when Donald Trump ran, he promised to make all this information public, and it hasn't been made public. So Bondi had a lot of egg on her face. She blamed the FBI, Director Patel, the New York field office.
Wasn't part of the problem that New York did not provide all the information until she demanded it through a letter? And then after the letter was written, then all of a sudden, thousands and thousands of documents show up. So, Kate, let me ask you, there's no timetable that's been made public. Has there been an acknowledgement that the reason there's no timetable is the explanation, the redactions, the information that can't be made public or they don't want to make public relative to victims?
Yeah, Vinnie, Bondi has acknowledged that it may take some time to go through these documents, sort through them, and really see what they are. And of course, like you mentioned, redact them if need be. She's also cited potential national security reasons as to why these documents might need to be redacted, in addition to protecting the identities of potential victims here. She's been questioned a little bit on why there would be a national security concern here. But of course, again, we don't know what these documents contain. We don't know if there are additional court depositions. We don't know if there are interviews with witnesses. We don't know even who's going to be named, if anyone, that we don't already know about in these new documents. So
some of the things, like the names that came out, we saw those before, prominent names, including Michael Jackson, Stephen Hawking. We knew about Donald Trump. We knew about Bill Clinton. But another one that jumped out at me, Louis Freeh, who was the head of the FBI. All these things make people very suspicious when names like this pop up. Now, the items found at Epstein's U.S. Virgin Islands home, a photo album of a girl and Epstein, a bag containing one set of copper handcuffs and a whip. Okay, this is the one for me. Dozens of computers, recording devices, and hard drives. Nima, do you think that's what the thousands of documents could be relative to here? What was on the computers, what's on the recording devices, what's on the hard drives, what's on the thumb drive? I mean, is that where all the information is that for some reason or another has never been made public?
I don't think so, because if it was any pertinent, relevant information, it would have been brought out in the Ghislaine Maxwell criminal trial, right? So I think that the information doesn't exist. I don't think there is a client list. Otherwise, it would have come out.
This is Al Capone's tomb here that we're talking about?
I think, unfortunately, it's going to be a dead end. And again, reading between the lines, it sounds like we're talking about pages and we're not talking about electronic files. So any information, this is an older case. There's been civil lawsuits. There's been litigation. It would have come out by now. Yeah, and Prince Andrew almost went to trial against Virginia Giuffre. There were tons of depositions taken. Believe me, I want to know what is on those computers more than anyone, Vinnie. But people that are watching and expecting there to be some sort of bombshell related to Jeff Epstein, I think they're going to be very disappointed. And frankly, I think Bondi did a poor job announcing this reveal if she hadn't reviewed or had someone review all this evidence beforehand.
So, Kate, what are folks saying on the ground down there in Florida? Are they expecting something that we don't know? Are they expecting something that will reveal names, powerful people, influential people directly connected to what was happening to those young women and girls?
You know, Vinnie, I think there's an expectation that there should be the release of more evidence, but also a fear that there isn't going to be anything new revealed in these documents, because I think that first release of about 200 pages, that really was nothing new. It provided us no additional context, nothing that hadn't already been released in court depositions and civil litigation. It was a big letdown for people. And so I think we're feeling a distrust from our community, from those that worked on the case, from former prosecutors in this area, a fear and a distrust that if we get another release of documents, that it isn't going to make a difference. There are, though, many that do hope that isn't the case. We've interviewed the mothers and the family members of some of the victims in this case, and many of them feel like there hasn't been enough accountability here. They are calling for not only the release, but also the prosecution of other names that could have been associated with Jeffrey Epstein. But, you know, Vinnie, as you well know, the struggle here is that everything we've received so far, while it contains hundreds of names, it doesn't imply any sort of guilt or any participation in the doings of Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, we take a look at that flight log, and nothing indicates that any of those people even went to Jeffrey Epstein's island. For example, we see Donald Trump named in those documents, but all we really see is him flying, say, to D.C. with Jeffrey Epstein. That isn't any admission of guilt. It's no implication of wrongdoing. And the same goes for those pages of his contact book.
Kate Hussey, Nima Rahmani, thank you so much. The story continues. Coming up next, and Nima brought this up, why didn't Ghislaine Maxwell give up the information?
Maxwell and Epstein had a method. Typically, they would befriend these young girls by asking them questions about their lives, pretending to be taking an interest in them.
10:15, a dog is heard barking.
This is the first case you'll ever hear that you've got to determine the time of death by a dog's wail.
There were no Ring cameras. There were no cell phones to ping off locations. Was that white Bronco there at the time you drove by it?
I didn't see it. There was one critical witness that was never called.
She saw O.J.'s white Bronco.
Trial and Error. Why did O.J. win? A Court TV original series. New episode Sunday night, 8 Eastern and Pacific. Only on Court TV.
Maxwell was among Epstein's closest associates and helped him exploit girls who were as young as 14 years old. Maxwell played a critical role in helping Epstein to identify, befriend, and groom minor victims for abuse. In some cases, Maxwell participated in the abuse herself.
All right, that's back in 2020. Now, after Epstein loses his life in custody, then all of a sudden the focus is put on Ghislaine Maxwell. Let's take a listen to that U.S. attorney, that's Audrey Strauss, prosecutor, talking about Ghislaine Maxwell and her role in all of this.
Starting in 1994 until at least 1997, Maxwell had a personal and professional relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. She pretended to be a woman they could trust. All the while, she was setting them up to be sexually abused by Epstein and, in some cases, by Maxwell herself.
Okay, so I want you to take a look at some of the images of Ghislaine Maxwell rubbing Jeffrey Epstein's feet. And I want you to see this so you understand the nature of this relationship, how bizarre and strange it actually is. It's one thing to, like, have your feet rubbed on the private plane, but it's another to do it like that and then memorialize it with pictures. These people are bizarre. They are freaky, right? But they're kind of in it together. Only one was alive, though, to go to trial, which brings us to the next question in my investigation. Why didn't Ghislaine Maxwell give up the information? Like, if the only card she had to play, she was in federal court, they had great evidence in the case, facing, 20 years in prison. If you got a card to play, aren't you going to play it? And isn't that card going after some big fish? So why didn't she? Let's get to the bottom of it. Joining me, investigative reporter and author of the book, The Spider Inside the Criminal Web of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, Barry Levine is with us. And here in studio, criminal defense attorney Josh Schiffer. All right, Barry, do you have a theory on why she wouldn't give up the information if she had it, right? Like, who else was involved in all this?
Ghislaine, the question is Ghislaine going to take what she knows to her grave, just like Jeffrey took what he knew and participation to his grave? Thus far, she has not given up anything. And as far as we know, there had never been a deal offered at the outset of this thing. You have to understand her mindset. She's an extremely stubborn individual who believes that she has done nothing wrong. Now, we know from interviews I conducted for my book, The Investigation, interviews with others, that she regarded these girls, these underage girls, as, I can say a quote, as trash. She didn't think anything of these girls. However, she was instrumental, particularly from the period of time of 1994 to 2004, in which her trial rested, in gaining these women, soliciting them, bringing them aboard, and also grooming them for Jeffrey. As I said in my book, they were the predator version of Bonnie and Clyde. They really worked together. As she, rots away in jail down in Tallahassee, Florida, the question is she ever going to get to the point where she's going to want to make it some type of a deal? And thus far, she is still refusing to admit any wrongdoing in this case.
I want to take a listen to Damian Williams, the former U.S. attorney, after the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell.
A unanimous jury has found Ghislaine Maxwell guilty of one of the worst crimes imaginable, facilitating and participating in the sexual abuse of children, crimes that she committed with her longtime partner and co-conspirator, Jeffrey Epstein. The road to justice has been far too long.
20 years, Josh Schiffer. That's a lot of time for someone who was living the life that she had lived up until the point of going to prison. Why didn't she give up the information? It's the only card to play, isn't it?
Yeah, but what is that card worth? And you've got to look at the risk-reward analysis as well as the utility of whatever she's going to share.
What's the risk?
Oh, risk? What happens to from all of these apparently notable individuals? What kind of power do they have? The levers behind the scenes. If you want to get into the scary conspiracy theory, some of these people can have people rubbed out just by snapping their fingers. And there's still allegations that Mr. Epstein was murdered or something like that. So there really wasn't a lot of value for her during the trial to come out and name some of the names because it wasn't going to exonerate her. She wasn't going to get a gift or a get from the U.S. attorney for ratting out some super famous celebrity. Much better for her to hold back, see if those names increase in value during her sentence.
You know, Barry, to me, I look at it and I'm like, it's the only potential chance, and it's something you could approach the U.S. attorney with, or you approach the Department of Justice. Is there any sense that they weren't interested in that?
No. Listen, they were obviously hoping that her and her lawyers would offer up something in terms of prosecuting some of Jeffrey Epstein's very powerful friends. She knows where the bodies are buried from the period of time from 1994 to 2004. That was her association with him. He continued on his own in terms of the recruitment of young girls up until he was finally arrested in New York. However, during that first 10-year period, there were associations with many, many powerful individuals, and she certainly knows, so much. But again, she's an individual who has refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. She's always operated under, an air of mystery. Right before she went on the lam, she showed off a book related to the CIA and a photograph after Jeffrey Epstein's death. Her father, Robert Maxwell, the Fleet Street publisher, was said to be an operative of the Israeli government. So she brings in a lot of espionage and
I get you.
Possible.
Very layered. All right, Barry's going to stay with us. Josh is staying with us. Up next, how many victims are there? I'm Vinnie Politan. We continue our investigation of the life and death of Jeffrey Epstein, who, since he died, has become an even more intriguing figure. How powerful was he, and the people that he spent time with, and who were the victims of his abuse? Here's the story.
Jeffrey Epstein was a financier and convicted sex offender who trafficked minors. His 2019 arrest, his controversial connections, and his mysterious death continued to spark public scrutiny. Epstein's victims have pursued justice through various legal avenues, resulting in both civil settlements and criminal investigations. In 2008, Epstein faced a lawsuit from a Virginia woman alleging sexual assault when she was 16. Similar suits followed, many resulting in out-of-court settlements. In 2019, Maria Farmer filed an affidavit accusing Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell of assaulting her and her 15-year-old sister in 1996. Virginia Giuffre's 2009 lawsuit accused Epstein and Maxwell of sexual trafficking when she was a minor. It was settled for $500,000. In November of 2022, Epstein's victims filed lawsuits against Deutsche Bank and JP Morgan Chase, alleging the bank's complicity in his crimes. By May of 2023, Deutsche Bank agreed to a $75 million settlement, and JP Morgan Chase settled for $290 million. These cases answered some questions, but many more questions have been left unanswered.
The discussion is always about Jeffrey Epstein, but the reason you discuss Jeffrey Epstein is because of the victims who suffered at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. I want you to take a look here, Gloria Allred, with one of those victims.
He put me in a vulnerable and dependent situation and took advantage of me. I was only 17 years old. I was a little girl.
So throughout all of this, you know, there's the curiosity and wondering who else is involved, who are all these powerful people, and then how large was this enterprise? How far did it go? That brings us to the next question in our investigation, and it's about the victims. How many victims are there in this case? Joining me, investigative reporter and author of the book, The Spider, Inside the Criminal Mind of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Barry Levine is with us. And in studio, criminal defense attorney, Josh Schiffer. Okay, so give us an idea, Barry, how, you know, the old question, how big is it? Like, how many victims are we talking about here, potentially?
Well, we know that more than 200 victims applied to the Victims Compensation Fund. That, you know, there was really hard work done by Denise George, who was the district attorney down the Virgin Islands, where Epstein had his home. And she really forced the executors of his estate to set up a Victims Compensation Fund. More than 200 women applied to that, and the Epstein's estate paid out more than $150 million. We also know, of course, based on Denise's work, that the two banks, JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank, also set up compensation funds and had to pay out over $300 million. So more than 250 women have applied and received compensation. But I estimate that there's probably a couple hundred other women who are victims, who are, you know, over Eastern Europe and in other locations, who we may never know the identities of these individuals and exactly what happened to them. You have to understand that after Jeffrey Epstein's slap on the wrist conviction down in Florida, he set up a different type of operation for himself. He had modeling fixers in Europe, in France, and elsewhere, ferry young women over to his island in the Virgin Islands, where he was kind of out of sight of investigators in the New York and Florida. So a lot of abuse took place in the years after that conviction, and these women were brought in by plane and sent back. And I estimate that probably at least 200 more women took part in kind of the second phase of Jeffrey Epstein's sick sex trafficking.
Unbelievable. I want to take a listen to Elizabeth Stein, one of the victims, just to give you a better idea of what these young women were going through.
I met her, as I said, in the course of my employment, and the first day that I met her, I offered to bring her packages to drop them off to her. It's something I frequently did for my high-end clients. And I called and arranged for the delivery of the packages. I was instructed to go to a hotel that was close by to the store in Midtown Manhattan. And when I arrived at the concierge, I let them know I was dropping her packages, and they let me know that she was in the bar area and she wanted me to meet someone. The person she wanted me to meet was ultimately Jeffrey Epstein, and that night in the hotel was the first time they assaulted me. My involvement with them lasted several years. I would try and get out of their view and try and get away from them, but every time I did, they found me. And it became so desperate that I started changing jobs. I changed apartments, cities, states, and even after all that, they found me. And years of running like that were really hard, and I started to crack. And I ultimately was hospitalized for a nervous breakdown.
It's life-altering. I mean, it's difficult for a lot of these young women, I would say probably most of them, to recover from all of this. Josh Schiffer, what are your thoughts about how many people we're talking, how widespread was this network that he created?
Well, just to give a little bit of context, my firm was involved in this, and we represented a victim, and we were there in court as all of this unfolded, especially how we got to that victims' compensation fund, which served a very useful purpose, which is providing anonymity. And that was something incredibly valuable, not just to the few women that were brave enough to come out and be public, but the literally hundreds of women that came forward through the process. And as we were just talking about, there are hundreds of women that I believe were involved that never came forward due to fear, due to self-involvement, due to the anxiety, due to wondering what level of victimization they may or may not had. Not every one of these women was trafficked down to the Virgin Islands or New York City. These women were victimized at a variety of different levels throughout this criminal conspiracy.
Let me ask you, Barry, because, and this kind of ties into another one of our questions tonight. With all these victims, it would seem that potentially some of them might have information about other predators. And has any of that ever come through? Have any of them ever talked about that? And has that been pursued in any way in terms of an investigation?
Well, we know Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who was the primary accuser, gave a list of more than a half a dozen men that she said she was trafficked to through Epstein. All of them have denied involvement. The prosecutors, when they went after Ghislaine, steered clear of her accusations, and they focused on 4 victims that testified against Maxwell at trial. And I have to report, sadly, that one of those victims who testified against her, in fact, died about a little bit more than a year ago of an accidental drug overdose. Despite all the compensation that did come through, which was fantastic to help these women attempt to recover their lives, those scars that they suffered in terms of the mental anguish from years ago is still very real and still living with many of these women. And for some of them, they've turned to drugs. They've sadly have turned to alcohol, anything to numb the horrific abuse that they suffered. And as I said, one of them who had testified against Maxwell sadly passed away. So we have to constantly think and consider what these women went through. And it's unbelievable when you read the court files and some of the police reports of the horrific abuse that took place.
Josh, I know you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, and let me rip this bandage off here as well, and talking about how these women recovered. A victims' compensation fund was formed, and it had many promises. One of the big concerns was, how much are these women going to realize? And unfortunately, at the conclusion of the victims' compensation fund payout, the Jeffrey Epstein estate was left with hundreds of millions of dollars of assets. And the plaintiff's universe goes nuts because just with a couple of trials, those victims should have bankrupted Jeffrey Epstein's estate. And it's an absolute betrayal of the justice system that his estate is still packed with money, and it's money now that other entities are going after. The victims' compensation fund was a failure because it didn't give justice to these actual victims.
All right, guests are staying with us. Still to come, did Epstein really take his own life?
Epstein was found hanged in his locked cell within the prison's secure special housing unit. The New York City's Office of the Chief Medical Examiner determined that Epstein died by suicide.
Grieving widow or mastermind behind a murder.
Monica Cementelli is accused of plotting to kill her husband.
Famed celebrity hairstylist Fabio Cementelli.
Prosecutors say she and her lover killed Fabio to collect a big life insurance policy.
The defense may say she's a bad woman, but she wouldn't be involved in a murder.
It's a whodunit Hollywood story. But will there be a twist that no one sees?
The Celebrity Stylist Murder Trial. Weekday mornings, only on Court TV.
Arguably one of the most notorious inmates in the BOP's custody was left unmonitored and alone in his cell with an excess of prison limits, thereby providing him with the opportunity to take his own life.
The death of Jeffrey Epstein is also part of the story and the skepticism of the public, like we're not getting the whole story. That's Michael Horowitz, Inspector General from the Department of Justice. I want you to take a look at him explaining what happened to Jeffrey Epstein from his perspective, you know, after investigating his death.
On August 10, 2019, Epstein was found hanged in his locked cell within the prison's secure special housing unit. The New York City's Office of the Chief Medical Examiner determined that Epstein died by suicide. We determined that MCC New York staff failed to ensure Epstein was assigned a cellmate, as instructed by MCC New York's Psychology Department following an incident on July 23rd, where Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell with a cloth wrapped around his neck. In addition, we concluded that MCC New York staff failed to undertake required measures designed to ensure Epstein and other inmates were accounted for and safe in their cells, such as inmate counts and rounds and searches of cells. Had Epstein's cell been searched as required, it would have revealed that Epstein had excess prison blankets, linens, and clothing in his cell. MCC New York staff also failed to ensure that the institution's security camera system was fully functional, resulting in limited recorded video evidence. While we determined MCC New York staff engaged in significant misconduct, we didn't uncover evidence contradicting the FBI's determination that there was no criminality in connection with how Epstein died.
Okay, brings us to the next question in our investigation. And this is a big one. This is a big one. Go on the internet, folks. There's a lot of folks talking about it, still talking about it. Did Epstein really take his own life? There's different ways to look at what the Inspector General said. You know, all this misconduct. Well, why was this misconduct? Was it simple negligence? Was it purposeful? What's going on here? Still with me, investigative reporter Barry Levine, and in studio, criminal defense attorney Josh Schiffer. Josh, I'll begin with you on this one. So the cameras aren't working. They're not searching. Is this just bad work by the folks on the inside? Is it purposefully not done? How can the public be convinced of what really happened here?
I really want to believe in the conspiracy theories. I really want to believe that there is an explanation. This is why he killed himself. Someone helped him kill himself. Someone may have been involved in murdering him. But I also know, having spent 25 years going in and out of big institutions like this, the SHU, yeah, it's higher security, but failed inspections every day. Watches that weren't made every day. Instructions not followed every single day. There are immunities from suing these facilities that basically, if you call attention to these problems, chronic problems, nothing gets done. It's why so many jails and prisons in America are under regular routine monitoring from the Department of Justice, from civil rights organizations, because these kind of problems exist in every facility. So if you're going to base the conspiracy that he didn't kill himself on the failures of underpaid guards, of a poorly run administration, and that dog don't hunt. It's absolutely possible, but I haven't seen anything that concludes it one way or another.
Barry Levine, your thoughts about the death of Jeffrey Epstein?
Yeah, you have to understand, this was a man who loved controlling things. The temperature had to be set at a certain degree in his different estates, certain amount of towels for all of his massages. He was very exact and very specific with his staff. Everything was taken away from him in that jail cell. He couldn't get the right medication. He was eating his meals on the floor. He knew that he wasn't going to get the slap on the wrist this time that he had down in Florida, that he likely was going to be convicted and that he would face possible violence, during a jail sentence. I really think he decided to take his life. That was the last bit of control that he had. He also, very damaging documents to the case in the case came out 2 days before he changed his will. He was going through a situation where his cellmate had been moved out, and another one was going to come in that next day. He had really one night to do it, and I do believe that he took advantage of that and decided that he was going to go out on his own terms and take his life, because that was the last bit of control that he had in his life.
Barry, where did he get all his money from?
Jeffrey made a lot of money through financial consultation with billionaires. He also, as I reported in my book, he was into arms dealing for a period of time, getting some money under the table in various ways. He managed to skirt the law in terms of how he took advantage of his finances. He was brilliant in terms of being a financial consultant, and he operated just on the line of legality to to develop an estate that at one point at the time of his death was worth $600 million.
Wow. And why so many famous friends or associations did he have? Was it just the money?
Jeffrey was a collector of people, and certainly powerful people. Early on in the show, you talked about that contact list. Now, a lot of those individuals never actually met Jeffrey Epstein, but Jeffrey Epstein collected information about wealthy people from all different walks of life, from the science community to the entertainment community. He was in the banking community. His relationships with former President Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, Donald Trump early on in the 90s. You have to understand that he wanted to connect these individuals with other individuals, try to do favors for them. And along the way, he also attempted to blackmail individuals. As we know, Bill Gates, who there's no indication that Bill Gates ever took part in any specific wrongdoing, but he admitted that Jeffrey Epstein attempted to blackmail him about a relationship he had with an individual. So Jeffrey was always on the lookout for the ways to connect people and gain favors from the rich and powerful.
Josh Schiffer, we have about 15 seconds here. Will the public ever be satisfied?
No, absolutely not. This is the most American story in the world, and it hits every salacious detail because we know how filthy behind the counter or behind the curtain is. We know that the richest people out there get away with everything in our current community.
Well, if those documents that get released have any more information, obviously we'll have you both back. Thanks so much, Barry Levine, Josh Schiffer. You know, the lack of trust in this case was born when prosecutors gave Epstein the deal of deals in 2008. Epstein then continued with his conduct, seemingly protected by those who were supposed to protect the victims. Why was that? That's the question that needs to be answered by the government through full transparency. I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.